So we're going to be talking about some cycle counting best practices and some tips. Just a little bit about us in case you haven't tuned into the previous webinars. We're RPI consultants, full service Lawson partner. We were founded in 1999. Our headquarters is located in Baltimore, but we're broadcasting to you today from Tampa. We have around 60 plus consultants nationwide, various certifications across the entire Lawson Invoice spectrum, and we're happy to be presenting for you. So we're going to talk about an overview of cycle counting, some setup requirements, getting your select IDs set up and working the way you want them to. We'll talk about some best practices. We'll go through a little bit of the handheld functionality and discuss prerequisites and some process overview.
So let's jump right in. The most important part is your select ID options. So IC70s need to be set up, and there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can set them up, and we'll focus on some of those today. You need to start here. So here we have the initial area, so you can choose to have all locations, whether or not you're requiring unit of measures, whether or not you want to count items that have zero stock on hand. And then there's also options to add particular classes or bins. So if you're using inventory classes as part of your IC11 setup, you can choose to do counts by that or by your bin groups. And then there's also ability to add some logic in. So if you're utilizing movement classes, which we'll touch on, you can set that up here. Whether or not if you have negative stock on hand, which hopefully you don't, but some people do, you can choose to include those items. And then you also can run this specific to particular items. So here we thought we'd just jump right into some leading practice options that you have available. What I really like is focusing on items that have high turnover. So here, if you're utilizing movement classes, if you aren't, I definitely recommend looking into this. Usually when you're setting up IC12 records, most places just default to a number, right? 1, 2, 3, whatever, and it just stays that way. But here, this movement analysis, you can basically add percentages here, and it's going off of costs. So here we're using 70, 20, 10. You go by periods, and you can choose to run this in non-update first and then view your results. From there, you can run this and export to CSV, and then from here you can see that it's taking all of your usage, the amounts that were processed out of your inventory for that time frame, and then it's giving you some suggested movement classes. And then from there, you could choose to modify those as you wish. If you have an item that doesn't have that much movement, but it's not exactly a 3, you feel like it should be a 2, you can override that either just by going into IC12 manually, or like I said, just export this to CSV and then run an upload process separately. So from here, as part of your select ID under logic, you can choose, as part of the select ID, you're focusing on your high moving product, and you're choosing to count a max of 5 items every 15 days. So here you're really focusing on those items that have a lot of moving stock. There can be a lot of errors there, and you want to touch on those as much as possible and continually check in on them. Whereas your movement class 3, this is also called ABC analysis, so that would be your movement class C. They don't move that frequently, right? And they could be low cost items, and you don't want to count those every week. Maybe you want to count them once every 2 months because they're just not moving. So this option gives you a little bit of flexibility with that to build that into your cycle count structure.
Another leading practice option is to base your select IDs off a location. So you would set up bin groups. You could set them up specifically row by row in your warehouse or your inventory area, area by area. This allows you to progress through your warehouse until you've counted all items. So Stephanie said you could add count days to count, so those items won't come up every time you're doing a little cycle count. And again, you're using your bin classes or your movement classes and bin groups to determine which items you're going to be counting.
So this is basically the option that most people utilize because you're by location, so all the products are in one place, and each day you can take on 2 sections of a row or something like that, depending on how large your inventory is. I feel like sometimes it can be overwhelming when you have such a large inventory in place. How can you possibly count all these items? So just putting it in smaller groupings, oftentimes you can eliminate the need for a annual or biannual physical inventory of all your products because you're continually showing that you're counting these items and keeping up with it. So another option is random counting. It definitely takes a little bit longer depending on what your max count is, but basically this is just going to just let the system randomly select items. It's pretty easy to manage, and I feel like it could just be helpful for, let's say, the warehouse manager to just spot check a couple things, and he wants to do that once a week and just count some random items. Here he can have some, or she can have some random counts and just process from there.
So we're getting into a little bit of what it looks like. So this is after you freeze your select ID, you want to check your select ID status on IC78 and make sure that it is indeed in use. So you'll see an asterisk in the in use column, and it'll show you when you've last froze those select IDs. And then once that comes through as in use, then you want to go back to your handheld and go into mobile par and cycle counting, click on cycle count, and you should see the actual select ID that's frozen. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time for that to flow through, so it could take a couple minutes for that to actually show up and be able to download. But once it shows up, you could check it off, click the download button, and then you'll be able to select it and begin your counts. So once you begin your counting, it brings you to the detail screen, so you could cycle through the items using the arrows, or you could go to the list tab to actually view the items in a list view, or you can actually scan the barcodes itself and it'll bring you right to that item as well. So sometimes the bin schemas get a little bit out of order, so using the barcode scanner allows you to keep going down in a line and not make sure you're not missing any items. After you've entered a count for all your items, it's a good idea to look at the list view just to make sure you have entered a count. So in the right hand column you can see the count that's been entered, and then verify that by going to the done, or you hit done, and then if that circle is completely filled in, that means you've entered a count for every single item on that select ID. If it's halfway filled in, it means you're missing a count somewhere along the way. So you go back to the list view and check out which item is missing a count, and then once you are completed with that, you check it off and hit the send button in the top right, and it'll send out your counts. So your cycle count has been sent.
Yay! So much better than that paper process, right? I mean, there's really not too much different with MSCM cycle counting, right? It's just adding in the handheld layer of being able to scan and make that process more efficient and automatically updating the counts in S3, right? So you're not doing the paper process and then manually entering those counts.
Exactly. It eliminates the back and forth between printing out your count sheets to writing it down to you going back into IC72, I think it is, to enter your counts. So it does eliminate a lot of risk or reduces the margin for error. couple prerequisites for setting up your select IDs, some things you wanted to take into consideration. Make sure your storeroom is clean and organized. It makes everyone's lives a lot easier when they're not shuffling through racks and bins to make sure all the items are there. So to having a clean and organized storeroom to start with definitely will help make the process more efficient. If there's any, while you're going through the storeroom, if there's any labels that are missing or damaged, it's a good time to update those labels and print out some new ones. And then you want to also verify your setup. So you want to verify your items have preferred bins set up on IC12. Verify that your select IDs in IC70 are set up the way you want it to, or if you're running it by location, if you're doing random counts. You want to make sure that they're set up the way you want so you get your desired results. And then before you actually go ahead and freeze those select IDs again, you want to make sure that your select ID is free and ready to use. So you check that on IC78, making sure it's just not in use. And then the last step is to make sure that you have you clear out all your unreleased IC and PO transactions, and you can run a report, the IC222 report, or view them on IC25 to clear those out.
Yeah, so that's definitely a area that I've seen a lot of issues, and I'm not sure there's been that much improvements in the newer versions, but basically, let's say you have a open PO30 in the system. It's created, but it's marked as unreleased. Something's being worked on. Who knows? But you freeze that item, and if for some reason once you unfreeze that item, the receipt still thinks that something's up with that item, so it won't let you release it. So you just have to delete it and recreate that PO30, which, it's only a couple clicks or whatever, but just good to add it into your practice that before you start this process, make sure things are cleared out. A little bit easier to do that for a annual or biannual count of your full inventory, not necessarily cycle counts, but just something to keep in mind. If you're running into bugs, it could be because it was frozen at you were doing a smaller cycle count and it was related to a receipt that didn't quite get closed out. All right, so just a quick overview if you're generally unaware of the cycle count process in Lawson. Basically, you start off, you create those select IDs and you freeze those items. Quickly verify it, they're properly frozen on IC 78. Verify the select ID on the handheld that's what you want to count. Start your count. From there, we recommend that you run IC 175 in non-update mode first. There it will help you capture anything that you may have missed as part of the account. Again, can be helpful during annual inventories where you have multiple different bin groups and different users are processing those accounts and they're rolling up. From there, you can enter remaining or updated counts on IC 72. So again, likely a little bit more beneficial as part of the annual inventory, but either you have your own auditing process or you have an auditor there that's walking through the count process with you. So obviously you'll want to capture those that didn't have any count process, they were missed, not even 0 was entered, but you even want to recount some of the perfect counts, right? And just make sure that they are in fact perfect. So it gives you opportunity here to build your own kind of list and send the counters out to recount. And then once you're feeling satisfied, you obviously can rerun the IC 175 and non-update again to refresh after you did the counts. But from there you can run IC 175 in update mode, and that's going to update your counts. So that will modify the stock on hand to the count that you entered and also give you some totals there. So we'll get into that on the next slide. Once that's completed, you delete the freeze records and then again just verify that they are in fact unfrozen in a sense. So variance review, very, very important. So like we just talked about, just running in report mode just gives you a little bit more visibility into some of the counts that are occurring before updating everything in the system. It will also provide you a recount list if you've missed any products, their count. You can utilize IC72 for any kind of corrections. It will let you know what page it's on. And then here we have an example of what the report looks like. So this can be really helpful because again, it's letting you know the item information, what was frozen, what the count quantity was, what the variance is, the amount, and any kind of accuracy percent here. It's also leaving you a little space if you wanted to add in a reason. So there's some additional functionality that you can layer in to basically code a particular variance for whatever reason. Either you found that it was damaged and you're using that instead of doing a separate transaction, you're layering that into your count process and moving that product and coding it that it was damaged or whatever. Here it's also letting you know the amount of unprocessed records, how many were inaccurate and what the dollars were for that inaccuracy, and also providing you a percent. Also will let you know the variance totals. So this can be really helpful. You want to get a sign off, right, before you actually process this in update mode and who's responsible. So more often used for the annual inventory, you may have multiple different locations, and ultimately you have one person that's accountable for that inventory and what's kind of happening there. So if you have a variance total for a lot of dollars, maybe you just want a signature there so you can print this out and have someone sign it saying, yep, it is what it is, and hold them accountable to that. So we've seen it used for that as well.
So what happens when you start getting error messages or you don't see your desired results or what you're expecting to see? It's time to get your rally caps on.
Yeah.
So we have a little shout out to our tech team with their rally caps on. So some common things that we see is frozen select IDs are not showing up on the handheld. So what happens there? You want to make sure that it's actually frozen and on IC78, and you want to make sure you give it sufficient time for to make its way over to the handheld itself.
Sometimes it can take some time, and if you're using par counting functionality, you may have experienced that sometimes there's this way too many updates happening. So MSCM kind of like stops in its tracks, right, and doesn't do all the updates. So you have to refresh. So what I've seen in my lifetime with MSCM is you're completing your annual inventory and you have a bunch of different locations and everyone goes and freezes it all at once. And MSCM just couldn't handle it. So we just created a audit report that basically said, here are all the items in this that we marked as frozen, and here's what's showing in MSCM. And we just verified that the quantities match before we actually physically began counting on the handheld. So just something to look out for depending on how many items you have built in that select ID that you're freezing. Another thing to really focus on is any kind of data integrity roadblocks. So we spoke about earlier just making sure that you're cleaning up and releasing any kind of unreleased transactions. So either releasing or deleting and recreating later. Also checking for any open in transits and trying to just close those out before moving forward. Also just making sure that you're closing everything out. So if you've inactivated items, make sure that you're also turning off bin tracking and all of that along with it, and clearing out preferred bin just to make sure everything's clean. Depending on what version you're on, I've seen issues with that. And then also, if you're utilizing IC12 for non-stock items, sometimes you just get fat fingers, enter something the wrong way or copying from another item, and And that can cause issues too, where all of a sudden this item pops up and it's not an item that you would count at all. It's not even in that location. Another thing that it doesn't look like we added to here is if you're utilizing like bin groups and building that into your select ID logic, you also want to verify that when you're adding new items or creating a new bin, that you're adding it to that bin group as well, right? So having a process that you're verifying that you're actually counting all the items that are in that location. For some of these, you actually will get errors on that variance report that says we can't update this because there's information missing or what have you. All right, question time.
Right. Let me pull them out.
So pretty high level overview, like we were talking about earlier. There's really not too much built within MSCM for this functionality. You have to have the right security access in order for this to occur, which we didn't really touch on, but it's basically a role in MSCM that's assigned to them, right? And then they need to have access to like these S3 forms to write to.
Right, in order to do it on the handheld, they would need to have the same access that would allow them to do it in the application itself.
So we do have a couple questions here. When freezing inventory, what exactly does that do? When we freeze, we have users that can still key orders and mess up our cycle counts.
Interesting. So you really have to like shut things down when you're performing these counts and trying to group them in smaller quantities. All it's doing when it's freezing is just not allowing any processing transactions to occur. So it shouldn't allow you to ship any orders.
But it can create demand records
should say that it's
potentially.
frozen.
Yeah, it'll give a error message. So yeah, you have to have a process behind it. It's difficult with cycle counting because you don't want to slow down too much of the process. You want to allow requesters to still request what they're looking for. But if you need more control, it's part of more of an annual count, and it's timed, and you have all these requests coming through. You could work with your IT to actually disable the bookmark, or send out some kind of alert that says, hey, we're stopping processing here. We'll have it back up and by 12 o'clock, or we'll alert you. So just some ideas there.
Is it ever something that people do where they do the cycle counting regularly, not once a year, but off hours, like when there's low order?
On weekends or off times.
Yeah, or later. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost just you have to let your inventory staff know too, right? Like if one person may be doing the counting, but maybe they stepped away, they needed a new piece of paper, or their pen ran out of ink or something. You kind of want to lock down to say these items are, I'm counting these items, and kind of mark them off to show that they're in queue and should not be touched. But sometimes it does happen, so you also should have that process documented where someone did have to rush and pull that item to put a note, like I had to pull this, add 1 to your count, and then when I process this order, it will decrement the right way.
Next question. Do you have to have bin tracking set to yes to use this process?
Good question. I believe the answer is no. We just need to have a bin built in order to utilize the bin group.
For the bin groups, yes.
So you can definitely populate the bin even when the bin tracking is set to no, which maybe not everybody knows.
I'm pretty sure.
No, you definitely can.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the location absolute variance total and the company absolute variance total on IC 175?
Great question. So it depends on how your organization is structured. They could be the same total, but for some organizations, they have multiple perpetual inventories for one location. So depending on how the IC 175 is run, it could display multiple different variances all rolled up on one report. So it really depends on how you run it. If you had 3 perpetual inventories happening all at once and how you set up your report, it could show different totals throughout the report. Anything else?
And that's all the questions we have for this presentation.